To focus on this fourth book in the Applications in Cosmology of Light series, which is a book essentially on transhumanism. But the book itself is called Triumph of Love, a mathematical exploration of being, becoming, life, and transhumanism in a cosmology of light. So, if we think about transhumanism, then just very simply speaking, it refers to a philosophy whose focus is to move beyond current human limits. In this book, however, what I focus on is a perception of light in order for transhumanism to become a real thing. And what do I mean by that? So let's step back. So if we look at the evolution of these books or the number of books that have been written in this series, the four-book series actually build on each other. So the very first book was a book called The Emperor's Quantum Computer, which is a take on quantum computation from a cosmology of light point of view. And stepping back further, this four-book series itself was built on a six-book series on cosmology of light, which what I sought to do was mathematically frame the power, the potentiality, the possibility that having light as the basis of existence might afford. So, in this point of view, we of course know that in our physical universe, light travels at 186,000 miles per second in vacuum, which we refer to as c. And my point of view is that that speed of light is an intentionality. It's an intentionality to basically allow a particular kind of materialization to occur. So, if we consider the native state of light to be one where it travels infinitely fast, then we can hypothesize that the reality that that would create through a thought experiment, if we consider, and we have a light source at the center and that light travels infinitely fast, then we know that that light would fill up the entire globe instantaneously. So there would be a quality or a property of presence that's afforded by the way light moves. If not of the nature of light were to arise, then light would subsume or overcome it, and so there would be a property of power. Since everything that arises and disappears is happening in the fabric of light, therefore, light, in a sense, has a knowledge of everything happening in its space, and therefore there's this property of knowledge that's also true of this reality where light travels infinitely fast. And finally, since everything is occurring in this fabric of light, there is an implicit harmony in it because things are connected in the nature of light, and therefore this property of harmony also arises. So we can hypothesize that implicit in light, there's these properties that we can call knowledge, presence, power, and harmony. And no matter how light might exist or how it might project itself or how it might precipitate, even down to 186,000 miles per second, there's really this fourfoldness that is maintained. And this fourfoldness, I'm going to make the point as we get to this book, Triumph of Love, is instrumental in the process of any kind of transhumanism or thinking about what the possibilities of transhumanism are. So essentially, we just introduced briefly this state of light where light travels infinitely fast, and we said that there's four properties that emerge as a result of it. Now, I call the series Cosmology of Light simply because if we assume that light may travel or can travel at different speeds, then we can hypothesize what kind of world it will create. They'll all be fourfold worlds, but we can hypothesize what kind of world it would create. And this precipitation would result in a materialization at this layer where light travels at 186,000 miles per second. So let me just elaborate to create the background for the essential argument in Triumph of Love. So, due to a process of quantization, some kind of quantization, these properties of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony that exist when light travels infinitely fast materialize themselves more concretely. And in that materialization, though it's not physical matter, but it's something, it's a different substance that's happening in another layer of light. We can perceive or conceive of these four essential properties becoming four sets of knowledge, presence, power, and harmony. And these sets can have up to infinite elements in them. And then through another quantization in which light projects itself at an even slower speed, but yet way beyond c, then we can conceive of different, unique, and an infinite number of seeds being created that are essentially due to combining the different elements in these four sets in unique combinations. And so, from that point of view, these subtle seeds become the base of all matter that will subsequently or eventually arise. And with a third quantization, which I've argued both in this live stream and in the books that I've written, there's a particular kind of materialization that occurs when that information that's implicit in light and is expressing itself as these diverse seeds, when that materialization holds itself in a particular way, or the potential of the materialization holds itself in a particular way, then there's a threshold value that is reached that we recognize as quanta or photons or whatever the kind of quanta might be. And this then results in matter as we understand it. And therefore we say that quanta is the basis of all matter. But from this point of view, there's this organized precipitation that's taking place along these four lines that become divergent because there's now infinite number of variations within these sets or possibilities of knowledge, presence, power, and harmony. So when matter and life emerge in the physical universe, there's a fourfoldness to that. And we can argue that this fourfoldness is essentially an explicitness of that implicit, of the four implicit properties in light. And because it's trying to maintain the integrality of this implicit fourfoldness, there's automatically a process of love that's occurring. And so, from this point of view, love is like a deep secret, or it's something that exists within light itself. And it becomes explicit as these four properties that materialize create the different foundations of matter and life that emerge. And let's give some examples of that. But that kind of trust for the materialization to hold itself in an embrace so that it creates a foundation, whether we're talking about space-time, energy, gravity, or quantum particles, or atoms, or cells, is essentially an act of love. And so, in Triumph of Love, what's being suggested is that with transhumanism, there has to be the same integrality that is the basis of it. So there has to be this wanting to connect with not only with deeper layers of light, but also with the diverse expression that light materializes as. And when that dynamic happens, that's an act of love, but that also becomes a solid foundation for any further emergence to occur. So let's take specific examples of the kinds I mentioned before. So space-time, energy, gravity. We know that these are very consequential macro parameters that define what's possible for us or how we can operate in this cosmos, if you will. But if we take a deeper look at space-time, energy, and gravity, then I'll make the case that space is a precipitation or some kind of a materialization of light's aspect of knowledge. Essentially, because if we think about that antecedent layer just behind the layer where light travels at c, so we're looking at the quantum veil, and just behind that, I'm proposing that there's infinite number of diverse seeds. And these seeds, they seek an arena for their materialization, and that arena we can think of as space. So the archetypal diversity of those seeds is nothing other than a glimpse of what knowledge is, or how knowledge might organize itself as it begins to precipitate in this material universe. So space, in this point of view, is therefore a materialization of light's aspect of knowledge. When we think about time, then time will track the maturity of any of these seeds that are in subtle form or have just materialized to the full potentiality that exists within them. And so time is clearly relative, but time tracks that maturity. And so there's an inevitability to what's going to happen in that point of view, because whatever is inside the seed will inevitably itself in its fullness, and therefore time becomes a precipitation of light's aspect of power. Now, in the process of the materialization from the subtle seed to its full material form, there's the presence of energy, and we know that energy is interchangeable with mass or matter, and therefore we can say that energy is a precipitation of light's aspect of presence. And further, we know that whatever might materialize in this physical realm, there's always an arrangement with other materializations. So seeds are collective with other seeds, or groups of seeds are collective with other groups of seeds. And therefore, when we think about this fourth cosmic parameter of gravity, it's nothing other than light's precipitation of its property of harmony. So we're saying that space-time, energy, gravity that creates a foundation for all subsequent emergences is an act of love. It's an act of love because there's the explicitness of what's inside light as presence, power, knowledge, harmony, becoming explicit as space-time, energy, gravity that then operate as one unit and a foundation from which other emergences might occur. And this kind of thinking, I'll take another example, but this kind of thinking is instrumental in thinking about the possibilities of transhumanism, because what we're saying is that any worthwhile, stable foundation that's been created materially or at the level of life has basically emulated the dynamics I just spoke about for the formation of space-time, energy, gravity, where the implicitness becomes explicit, and in the explicitness, there's an embrace that is love that becomes a foundation for other meaningful things to emerge. So we must see the same thing if we want to go down a path of sustainable transhumanism. And that really what this is book, Triumph of Love, is exploring. But it's built on the previous books of an alternative view of quantum computation. And very, very briefly, when we think about a cosmic quantum computation, we may say that there's an arbitration between these different layers of light that I suggested have different kinds of information in them. And there's an arbitration between these different sources of information or different manifestations of information and what's already been manifested in the material plane. And this arbitration is a process of quantum computation, because we're saying that these layers of light are nothing other than a quantization of possibility that exists when light travels infinitely fast. And so implicitly, there's this quantum computation that shows itself as quantization that's occurring. And this continues at the quantum veil antecedent to light traveling at a speed c. And anything that emerges in this layer where light travels at c is due also to this persistent quantum computation that's occurring. Um, the, the other book that builds on this, and that's a prerequisite to the notion of transhumanism, is, imagine you have some computational process, and that computational process has inputs and it has outputs. And we've said that the inputs are different sources of possibility that exist at different layers of light, plus also the possibility that is materializing here at this physical realm. And that those inputs create an output, and genetics and genetic type information is the output of that persistent quantum level computation. So that really is what the origins and possibilities of genetics really focus on, which is what I spoke about just a couple of days ago. And then is the idea, which is also a prerequisite to transhumanism, is the idea of singularities or completeness manifest. Here I call this the second singularity to differentiate from the common narrative of singularity that has arisen, whether in scientific realms or in artificial intelligence as we've comprehended it today. And this second singularity is in a sense a capstone event, which follows a trend in which many different partial singularities have already emerged, and space-time energy gravity being one such partial singularity. And why is it a singularity? It's a singularity because it emerges from a common light-based edifice. So all the logic, all the possibilities, all the potential that exists in this light edifice is still maintained when space-time energy gravity arises. So there's a comprehensiveness, a completeness, and therefore it has the status of a singularity. But I call it partial singularity because I'm making an assumption that space-time energy gravity is perhaps that level of awareness, of self-awareness, hasn't arisen yet. So self-awareness arises when life arises and when mind arises, which are subsequent partial singularities. And when that self-awareness becomes completely aware that it is one with this light-based edifice that animates all things, then that is the basis for the second singularity. So transhumanism can be thought of as something that happens on the path to the second singularity, and perhaps also beyond whatever is beyond the second singularity. So this book, essentially, the second singularity is therefore a prerequisite also to the idea of transhumanism, because also in the book on transhumanism or Triumph of Love, it's suggesting that any partial singularity or singularity that's a light-based singularity as opposed to an AI-based singularity has implicit in it a beingness, a becomingness, the basis of life. And so whether it's space-time energy gravity or whether it's the fourfold quantum particles that are expressed perhaps best in the Standard Model, or whether it's the atoms in a periodic table that are classified as S shell, P shell, D shell, F shell, again, a fourfoldness, or whether it's molecular plans that animate a cell, that there are only four molecular plans, that of polysaccharides, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So it's when all these different components of presence, power, knowledge, harmony that are implicit in light become explicit as these fournesses, and they embrace each other. then we can say that there's a cohesive being that has manifested. So something has become that's a being. And so, in a sense, these partial singularities and any light based singularity already has something in it that is of a fullness of life, of a particular kind of life. And so when we think about transhumanism, it's basically what I'm proposing is that this same trend has to be followed. And this trend, where there's a completeness, so that this fourness that has created all these partial singularities or light based singularities before it becomes or continues to be the basis of any effort at transhumanism. And my argument is that if that's the case, then that kind of transhumanism, as opposed to, say, something that is severed from the light-based edifice and is purely a technological conception based on conceptual space in the mind, it's going to be fundamentally different. And the possibilities that arise and the kind of development that can occur on that kind of foundation that is a light-based singularity is going to be entirely different. But again, at the base of this is love, because we're saying that that foreness that manifests itself and decides to embrace each other is nothing else but an act of love.